Cormac was a king made of iron, wet earth, and frost. The kind of alpha who watched his enemies bleed out in the mud with the exact same blank stare he gave the morning rain. He didn't do passion, he didn't do posturing, and he certainly didn't do jealousy, until the feast of the winter solstice. Until Isolde, his silent political bride, looked across the fire at a rival warlord and gave him a smile that tasted like a secret. That was the night the iron broke. That was the night the wolf took over. The throne of the northern ridge was not a seat of glory. It was carved from the stump of a petrified oak, and it smelled perpetually of damp rot and old sweat. Cormac sat in it, with his spine rigid, listening to the monotonous dripping of rain through a crack in the vaulted stone ceiling. He was 34 years old, but his joints ached like an elder's. Leadership in the north didn't mean gold crowns, it meant adjudicating disputes over stolen sheep, rationing salted venison so the pack wouldn't starve before February, and putting down challengers who thought youth and fangs were enough to run a territory. Beside him sat Isolde. She was a peace treaty, wrapped in heavy grey wool. 3 months ago, her father, a minor alpha from the coastal lowlands, had offered her to Cormac in exchange for a battalion of enforcers to guard his ports. Cormac had agreed because the arithmetic made sense. He hadn't factored in the scent of her, underneath the smell of the damp wool, the wood smoke of the great hall, and the greasy odour of roasted mutton. She smelled faintly of crushed rosemary and sea salt. It was a clean, sharp scent that cut through the stale air of the keep and lodged itself directly in the primitive centre of his brain. Cormac didn't look at her. He made it a point never to look at her for longer than courtesy demanded. He told his generals he was giving her space. He told himself he was maintaining a necessary, clinical distance. He was the Alpha King. His authority rested on his absolute, terrifying stoicism. A king who obsessed over a lowland girl's pulse rate was a king who could be manipulated. The eastern perimeter is flooding again. Finn, his beta, grunted, leaning a muddy boot against the edge of the hearth. Finn's beard was matted with sleet. The river breached the banks. We lost 3 outposts. Send the builders at first light, Cormac said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Double the patrols along the tree line. The flood will push the feral rogues higher up the ridge. Builders can't work in this mud, Cormac. They will work, Cormac said, shifting his weight. The petrified wood groaned. Or the rogues will tear their children apart in their beds. Explain it to them exactly like that. Finn nodded once, a terse jerk of his chin, and stepped back into the shadows. Cormac took a breath. As his chest expanded, his heightened hearing picked up a subtle shift beside him. Isolde's breathing changed, just a fractional hitch in the rhythm. Her hands, resting in her lap, were bare. She had calluses on her thumbs from a loom and a small, faded scar across her knuckles. She wasn't a delicate aristocrat, but she hated this place. He knew it. She never complained. She never wept. She just sat there, a silent ghost enduring her sentence in a freezing fortress. They shared a bedchamber, yet they slept with a vast, invisible chasm of furs between them. Cormac would lie awake for hours, listening to the wind howl against the shutters, fiercely ignoring the warmth radiating from her side of the mattress. He believed he was doing her a favor. He was a killer, a scarred brute who tasted blood in his sleep. She was coastal sunshine and rosemary. Keeping his hands off her was the only decent thing he had ever done. He thought she understood this silent arrangement. He thought the boundaries were set in stone. He was the cold wall. She was the ivy reluctantly growing on it. There was no expectation of warmth, but the beast inside him, the massive, scarred wolf that paced relentlessly against the bars of his ribcage, was growing restless. The wolf didn't care about politics. The wolf didn't care about stoicism. The wolf only knew that the female smelling of the sea belonged to them, and every day she sat beside them without her scent. carrying the heavy, musky mark of their claim, was a day spent in agony. Cormac tightened his jaw until his teeth ground together, forcing the beast back down into the dark. "Is the hall too draughty for you?" he asked, not turning his head. The words felt like sandpaper in his throat. Isolde paused. She slowly turned her face toward him. Her eyes were a dark, stormy amber. "It is exactly as draughty as it was yesterday, my lord. I am managing." Her voice was polite. Perfectly, maddeningly polite. It was the tone one used to address a tax collector. "Good," Cormac grunted, staring straight ahead at a hunting hound scratching at a flea by the fire. He didn't notice the way her jaw tightened, or the brief, bitter flash in her amber eyes before she looked away. He only knew that the smell of rosemary suddenly turned a little sharper, a little more distant. The heavy oak doors of the great hall shuddered before swinging inward with a violent crack. A gust of freezing rain blew in, scattering the rushes on the stone floor and making the hearth fires violently spit and hiss. The low hum of conversation among the pack members died instantly. Knives were set down, spines straightened. The hounds stopped scratching and issued low, rumbling growls from the backs of their throats. Through the threshold walked Gareth. He was the emissary for the Southern Valleys, a rival coalition of packs that controlled the fertile farmlands below Cormac's Ridge. Where Cormac's people were hardened and weather-beaten, wearing boiled leather and furs, Gareth looked like a creature from a different world entirely. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a fluid, arrogant grace that immediately set Cormac's teeth on edge. He wore a cloak of deep crimson wool, lined with imported silk. His boots were polished leather, free of mud. His dark hair was tied back neatly, and he smelled of citrus, cedar, and an expensive, oily musk. To a human nose, he smelled pleasant. To the wolves of the northern ridge, he smelled like an invasion. "King Cormac!" Gareth called out, his voice booming effortlessly over the howling wind outside. He walked down the center aisle of the hall, not bothering to look at the snarling faces of the northern wolves flanking him. He stopped a respectful distance from the high table and offered a bow that was just shallow enough to be insulting. "The Southern Valleys send their warmest regards." "Shut the doors!" Cormac ordered loudly. Two guards hauled the heavy oak shut, sealing out the storm. The sudden silence in the hall was deafening. "We don't have much use for warm regards up here," Cormac said, resting his forearms on the table. He felt the familiar, heavy thrum of adrenaline flooding his veins. His wolf was already pacing, sizing up the rival alpha, calculating the exact amount of force required to snap his neck. "What do you want, Gareth?" Gareth smiled. It was a bright, practiced expression that reached his eyes. "Always straight to the point. We've come to finalize the trade agreements for the spring thaw. Grain and steel for your timber. My betas can handle the ledgers," Cormac dismissed coldly. "You didn't ride through a sleet storm just to count bags of wheat." "No," Gareth admitted, his gaze drifting lazily. "I suppose I wanted to see the infamous fortress of the ridge for myself. They say it's a grim place, but—" Gareth's eyes stopped moving. They locked onto the seat beside Cormac. "I see the rumors failed to mention the keep's finest treasure." Cormac felt a muscle in his cheek twitch. A low, vibrating hum started deep in his chest. A warning growl, so quiet it was more of a vibration against his sternum than a sound. Gareth stepped forward, closing the distance to the high table, his eyes fixed entirely on Isolde. He offered a much deeper, far more genuine bow. "Lady Isolde of the Coasts, it is a tragedy that your beauty is hidden away in these bitter mountains." Isolde sat perfectly still. She didn't shrink away from Gareth's intense focus, nor did she lean into it. Cormac watched her out of his peripheral vision, his heart hammering a slow, heavy, defensive rhythm. "My Lord Gareth," Isolde said, her voice steady. "The mountains are harsh, but they build character. I am surviving. Merely surviving is a poor existence for someone like you, Gareth said smoothly, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. In the south, the sun is still warm, even in winter. The gardens are in bloom. Cormac stood up. The screech of the heavy wooden chair dragging against the stone floor echoed like a gunshot. Every wolf in the hall tensed, preparing for violence. Cormac towered over the table. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't roar. He simply let the suffocating, heavy aura of his alpha dominance bleed into the room. The air grew thick. Several younger wolves near the back of the hall whimpered and dropped to their knees, unable to withstand the pressure. Gareth's smile faltered. The smugness drained from his face as the sheer physical weight of Cormac's presence pressed down on him. "You will sit at the lower tables, Gareth," Cormac said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "You will eat the meat provided. You will negotiate with Finn in the morning, and you will not address my wife again, unless spoken to." Gareth swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The primal instinct to submit was warring with his pride. He managed a stiff nod. "As you command, King Cormac." Cormac sat back down. The oppressive weight in the room lifted instantly, leaving the hall gasping for air. He didn't look at Isolde. He didn't need to. He could smell the sudden spike of adrenaline in her blood. He thought he had protected her. He thought he had established the unyielding boundary of his territory. He was a fool. He had only shown her exactly where his armor was weakest. The feast was a loud, greasy affair. Trenchers of roasted boar were passed down the long wooden tables, the fat congealing quickly in the cold air of the hall. Ale sloshed from heavy wooden tankards, soaking into the dried rushes on the floor. Cormac picked at a piece of tough meat with his hunting knife, chewing methodically. He wasn't hungry. His entire nervous system was wired tight, humming with an uncomfortable static. Gareth sat at the high table, a concession to his status as a diplomatic envoy, though Cormac had placed him as far down the wood as protocol allowed. It wasn't far enough. Despite Cormac's warning, Gareth was holding court. The Southern Alpha was charismatic, weaving tales of border skirmishes and political intrigue that had half the northern wolves leaning in to listen. He had a way of speaking that drew people into his orbit, a stark contrast to Cormac's brooding, terrifying silence. Cormac pretended to listen to Finn outline the lumber yields, but his hearing was dialed exclusively to the frequency of Isolde's breathing. She was sitting quietly, eating small portions, staring into the middle distance. But Cormac noticed the subtle shifts. She was leaning, just a fraction of an inch, toward Gareth's end of the table. She was listening to him. "It was a trap, of course," Gareth was saying, laughing over his tankard. "3 rogue wolves waiting in the ravine. But my vanguard is fast. Before they could even sound a howl, we had them flanked." A few of the northern warriors chuckled, grudgingly impressed. "It takes a certain kind of recklessness to ride into a blind ravine," Isolde spoke up. The table went quiet. Cormac's knife stopped mid-carve. The blade pressed into the scarred wood of the table. Gareth turned to her, his eyes lighting up. "Recklessness, my lady? I prefer to call it calculated confidence. Calculations often fail when the terrain is unfamiliar," Isolde countered. Her voice wasn't the polite, flat tone she used with Cormac. It was animated. There was a spark in it. "My father lost 12 men trying to flush rogues from a coastal cave because he trusted his confidence over the tides." Gareth leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, completely ignoring the smouldering Alpha King sitting just feet away. "Then it seems your father and I share a tragic flaw. We underestimate the environment when there is a prize to be won." He looked directly into Isolde's eyes when he said the word prize. Cormac's knuckles turned white around the hilt of his knife. The beast in his chest slammed violently against his ribs. "Mine." The word echoed in his skull, dripping with venom and instinct. "Mine. Tear his throat out. Paint the stones with him." He forced himself to breathe. I am a king. I do not act like a feral dog fighting over a bone. Perhaps, Isolde said softly, and then she did it. Isolde shifted her gaze. She didn't look at Gareth. She looked directly at Cormac. For a millisecond, their eyes met. Her amber eyes were sharp, calculating, and stripped of the usual dull resignation. She looked at him with acute intent, ensuring he was watching, ensuring he was listening. Then she turned back to Gareth, and she smiled. It wasn't a polite, closed-mouth curve of the lips. It was a genuine, radiant smile. A dimple appeared on her left cheek. Her teeth flashed in the firelight. It transformed her entire face, washing away the drab grey of the north and replacing it with blinding, devastating colour. She looked beautiful. She looked alive. She had been here for 3 months, and Cormac had never seen that smile. He hadn't even known she possessed it, and she had just given it to an arrogant, perfumed southern prick. The reaction inside Cormac wasn't an emotion. It was a physical injury. Jealousy hit him not like a pang of sadness, but like a heavy warhammer swinging into his gut. The breath was punched completely out of his lungs. A ringing sound started in his ears, high and shrill, his vision edged with red. The smell of Gareth's citrus and musk suddenly morphed into the overpowering stench of a threat. It felt as though a frozen dagger had been shoved between his ribs and violently twisted. Crack. The sound was sharp and sudden. The heavy, iron-bound drinking glass in Cormac's left hand shattered under the immense pressure of his grip. Shards of thick glass drove into his palm. Dark, almost black alpha blood spilled over his knuckles, dripping steadily onto the white tablecloth. Drip, drip, drip. The conversation at the table died instantly. Gareth froze, his eyes darting to Cormac's bleeding hand, the colour draining from his face. Finn tensed, his hand dropping to the axe at his belt. Cormac didn't look at his hand. He didn't feel the glass embedded in his flesh. He slowly turned his head, the red bleeding into his irises, his jaw set so hard it looked carved from granite. He stared at Isolde. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was staring at his bleeding hand, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The scent of rosemary was spiked heavily with adrenaline and fear. No, not fear. Anticipation. She had done it on purpose. She had thrown a lit match into a powder keg just to see if the King of Ice and Iron would actually burn. Cormac stood up slowly. He didn't say a word. He didn't wipe his hand. He simply turned and walked away from the high table, his heavy boots echoing like funeral drums against the stone floor, leaving a trail of blood drops behind him. He needed to get out. He needed the freezing air, because if he stayed in that room for 1 more second, he was going to rip Gareth's head from his shoulders and claim his wife on the blood-soaked table. And they both knew it. The cold hit him the moment he kicked open the iron-banded door to the lower courtyard. It was a vicious, biting wind carrying sheets of freezing rain, the kind of weather that killed livestock in the fields and froze men to their saddles. For Cormac, it was a necessary shock to the system. He didn't seek shelter under the covered walkways. He strode directly into the center of the muddy training yard, letting the deluge soak through his tunic, matting his thick, dark hair against his skull. The rain felt like 1,000 tiny needles against his skin, a stark, physical sensation to counter the blinding, static buzzing in his brain. He stood there in the dark, chest heaving, staring down at his left hand. It was a mess. The thick shards of the goblet had bitten deep into his palm, tearing through calluses and muscle down to the bone. Because of his alpha blood, the healing process was already trying to knit the flesh back together, but it was trapping the foreign glass inside. It throbbed with a hot, sickly pressure. Cormac pinched a jagged piece of glass protruding near his thumb and pulled. The flesh resisted, then tore with a wet, sickening sound. A fresh wave of thick blood spilled over his wrist, mixing with the rain and dripping into the mud. He threw the shard to the ground. He didn't wince. The sharp, localized agony in his hand was manageable. It was logical. Flesh tore, flesh bled, flesh healed. It was infinitely easier to process than the sensation in his chest. A tight, suffocating panic that felt uncomfortably like weakness. She smiled at him. He closed his eyes, the rain washing the blood from his fingers. The image of Isolde's face, illuminated by the fire, looking at Gareth with that bright, devastating spark, flashed behind his eyelids like lightning. His jaw clamped down so hard his teeth ached. He had spent 3 months carefully building a fortress around her, brick by brick. He had kept his distance. He had starved his own instincts to spare her the reality of being mated to a monster, and in 5 seconds she had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation just to see what would happen. Footsteps sloshed heavily through the mud behind him. Cormac didn't turn. He recognized the heavy, uneven gait of his beta. "The southern prick is still talking," Finn said, coming to a halt a few paces away. Though his voice is about an octave higher now. "You scared the piss out of half the hall." "I broke a cup, Finn," Cormac said, his voice a low rumble over the storm. He gripped another shard embedded near his lifeline and ripped it out. "They will survive. You leaked alpha dominance so hard, the hounds threw up in the kennels," Finn corrected flatly. The beta crossed his thick arms against the rain. The girl played a dangerous hand. We all saw it. She used the southerner as bait. Cormac's silence was a heavy, dangerous thing. He pressed his thumb against the bleeding wounds, forcing the last of the glass out before his flesh could heal over it. "She is unhappy," Cormac finally rasped, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "She hates the cold. She hates the keep. She hates the isolation." "So she decided to poke the bear to see if it would bite," Finn concluded. "Look, Cormac, you've been treating her like a fragile porcelain doll since the day her father dumped her on our borders. You barely look at her. You speak to her like a commanding officer addressing a new recruit. Did you think she was just going to sit by the fire and knit until she died of old age?" "I am keeping her safe," Cormac snapped, whipping around to face his beta. His eyes flashed a bright, unnatural gold in the darkness. "From me." Finn didn't flinch. He had fought beside Cormac for 15 years. He was immune to the glowing eyes and the posturing. "You're an idiot. She's a wolf, Cormac. Lowland or not, she's a wolf. She doesn't want a warden. She wants a mate. And right now, she's looking around the room and wondering why the man she's shackled to acts like a dead piece of wood." Cormac turned away, staring out over the black, jagged peaks of the ridge. The wind howled, a lonely, desperate sound. "Gareth leaves tomorrow," Cormac said, the finality in his tone signaling the end of the discussion. "Double his guard. If he wanders out of his assigned quarters tonight, put an arrow in his leg. Claim he looked like a rogue in the dark." "And the girl?" Finn asked quietly. Cormac looked down at his hand. The cuts were already closing, leaving angry pink scars across his palm. The physical wound was gone, but the heavy, bruising weight in his gut remained. "The girl is my wife," Cormac said. The word felt strange, heavy and possessive on his tongue. "I will deal with her." He walked past Finn, heading back toward the keep. The rain had washed the blood from his hand, but he could still smell the sweet, cloying scent of Gareth's citrus musk lingering in the air. A ghost he fully intended to exorcise. The bedchamber was freezing. The servants had built up the fire in the massive stone hearth, but the heat struggled to push past the heavy chill radiating from the thick stone walls. Cormac sat on the edge of the massive oak bed. He had stripped off his wet tunic and sat bare-chested in the dim light, the fire casting flickering shadows over the dense map of scars crisscrossing his torso, souvenirs of a lifetime spent keeping the northern ridge from tearing itself apart. He had wrapped his left hand in a length of crude linen. It wasn't bleeding anymore, but the cloth hid the newly healed, tender flesh. He stared at the flames, listening. He heard her footsteps long before the heavy wooden door creaked open. Her tread was light, but not hesitant. She closed the door behind her with a solid thud, dropping the iron latch into place. The silence that followed was suffocating. Cormac didn't move. He didn't look at her. He waited for her to go to her side of the room, to retreat behind the folding screen and change into her thick nightgown, to slip under her pile of furs on the far side of the mattress. That was their routine. That was the script. She didn't follow the script. She walked toward the center of the room and stopped. The scent of her, sea salt and rosemary, was overwhelming in the enclosed space. But beneath it, Cormac could smell the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. Her heart was beating fast, a steady, rapid thrum that he felt in his own teeth. "Does it require stitches?" Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Cormac slowly turned his head. Isolde was standing near the foot of the bed. She had shed her heavy, formal shawl. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted a fraction of an inch. She wasn't shrinking. She was waiting for the fallout. "No," Cormac said. His voice was rough, scraping against the quiet of the room. "I heal fast." "I know," she said. "Do you?" Cormac stood up. The sheer size of him dominated the space. When he stood, the ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop. He didn't walk toward her, but the sudden shift in his posture was enough to make the air feel dangerously thin. "You play a very foolish game, Isolde," he said softly. The softness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. It was the low growl of a predator that had already decided to strike. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, keeping her gaze locked on his collarbone. She wouldn't look him in the eye. "Look at me." She didn't move. I said, "Look at me." The alpha command slipped into his tone, a heavy, resonant frequency that bypassed logic and went straight to the spine. Isolde's head snapped up. Her amber eyes met his, and he saw the flash of pure, unadulterated defiance in them. She wasn't sorry. "You used a foreign alpha to test the length of your leash," Cormac stating the facts coldly, devoid of the raging fire burning in his chest. "You smiled at him. You engaged him. You made sure I saw it." "Why?" Isolde's hands curled into fists at her sides. She took a step toward him. The fear he had smelled earlier was evaporating, replaced entirely by a hot, rising anger. "My leash," she echoed, her voice trembling with indignation. "Is that what I am to you? A dog tied up in your courtyard? You are my wife. You are the queen of the northern ridge." "I am a ghost," she fired back, the polite facade finally shattering. Her voice cracked, echoing loudly off the stone walls. "I am a ghost haunting a freezing castle. For 3 months, you haven't spoken to me unless it's to ask if I am cold or if the food is acceptable. You look through me, Cormac. You treat me like a piece of furniture that came with a treaty. I treat you with respect," he growled, taking a step toward her. The space between them vanished. He was close enough now to feel the heat radiating off her skin. "I keep my distance because I know you did not choose this." "I didn't choose the treaty, no," she breathed heavily, looking up at him, her chest heaving. "But I am here. I am alive. And I wanted to see if the man I was chained to was actually alive too, or if he was just a statue carved out of ice." "And?" Cormac stepped closer. His bare chest brushed against the heavy wool of her dress. He saw her pupils dilate. He heard the sudden hitch in her breath. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The scent of her was a drug, bypassing his brain and flooding his veins with pure instinct. "Did you find out?" "I found out you possess a temper," she whispered, refusing to back down, though her body was trembling slightly. I found out you can break glass when a man from the south looks at me. But I still don't know if you actually care, or if you're just a territorial beast guarding his property." Cormac's breathing stopped. The accusation hit him harder than a physical blow. A territorial beast guarding his property. He raised his uninjured right hand. He saw her flinch, a tiny, involuntary twitch of her eyelid. The beast in him roared at the insult of her fear, but he forced his hand to move slowly. He brought his fingers up and gently, carefully, traced the line of her jaw. Her skin was incredibly soft. It was warm. She shuddered under his touch, a violent, full-body tremor. "If I were merely a beast guarding property," Cormac murmured, his thumb brushing over the pulse point on her neck, feeling the frantic, hammering rhythm of her heart. Gareth's head would currently be on a pike above the main gate. He leaned in closer. His lips hovered a fraction of an inch from her ear. He could smell the rosemary, but now it was mixed with the sweet, intoxicating scent of her arousal. The friction of her anger had sparked something else, entirely. "I stayed my hand," he whispered, his rough voice vibrating against her skin. "Because if I had killed him, it would have started a war. And if a war comes to these mountains, you will be in danger." He pulled back, forcing himself to break the physical contact. The effort it took to drop his hand to his side was monumental. His muscles screamed in protest. "Do not smile at him again, Isolde," Cormac said. There was no anger in his voice now, only a raw, desperate warning. "Because I am holding on to my sanity by a very thin thread. And if you cut it again, I will not be responsible for what the wolf does." He turned his back on her and walked to his side of the bed. He lay down on top of the furs, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in his body wired and burning. He didn't sleep, and he knew, by the ragged, uneven sound of her breathing across the mattress, that she didn't either. The morning brought no relief. The storm had broken, but it left behind a landscape of freezing fog and knee-deep, sucking mud. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, promising more sleet before nightfall. Cormac stood in the lower bailey, watching the stable hands saddle the heavy draft horses. Today was the border patrol. It was a required show of force, taking the southern emissary along the newly flooded eastern perimeter to prove the north was holding its line against the feral rogues pushed up by the rising water. Gareth emerged from the keep, looking entirely too rested. He wore a heavy, oiled leather riding coat that managed to look tailored despite its utility. He was smiling, talking animatedly to two of his own southern guards. Cormac tightened the cinch on his massive black gelding, pulling the leather strap until the horse grunted. "He thinks he won," Finn muttered, coming to stand beside Cormac's horse. "He thinks you breaking that glass last night was a sign of weakness, a loss of control. In the south, alphas who show their temper are considered unrefined. Weak. Let him think it," Cormac replied, swinging up into the saddle. The heavy armor clinked against the leather. "The South deals in court politics. The North deals in survival. He'll learn the difference." The riding party consisted of Cormac, Finn, 5 elite northern warriors, Gareth, and 2 of his southern guards. They rode out in silence, the thick mud sucking at the horses' hooves with loud, wet, popping sounds. The air was bitterly cold, freezing the moisture inside their nostrils. For 3 hours they rode the ridgeline, inspecting the broken timber outposts and the swollen, raging river below. The water was black and churning, carrying torn-up trees and the carcasses of drowned livestock. Gareth rode his sleek, chestnut mare up beside Cormac. The southern horse was nervous, dancing sideways in the mud, clearly unaccustomed to the treacherous footing. "A grim border, King Cormac," Gareth called out over the roar of the flooded river. He had a smug curve to his mouth. "It takes a harsh breed of men to live in this filth. I must confess, I don't envy you." "We don't require your envy." Cormac stared straight ahead. Still, Gareth pressed, adjusting his reins. It makes one wonder. Such a desolate place. No art, no culture, no warmth. It is a wonder your lovely queen does not wither away like a plucked flower. Cormac's hands froze on the reins. The gelding beneath him stopped, sensing the sudden, terrifying stillness of its rider. She is resilient, Gareth continued, seemingly oblivious to the drop in temperature around him, or perhaps banking on his diplomatic immunity. We had quite the conversation last night. She has a sharp mind. It's a pity it has no whetstone here to sharpen itself against. Finn, riding a few paces behind, quietly slid his hand toward the heavy crossbow slung across his back. The northern guard stiffened, their wolves pushing near the surface, waiting for the Alpha's command to strike. Cormac didn't draw a weapon. He didn't yell. He slowly turned his head to look at Gareth. A whetstone, Cormac repeated softly. A metaphor, my king. Gareth smiled patronizingly. I merely mean she requires stimulation. At that exact moment, the wind shifted. Cormac's nostrils flared. The scent cut through the smell of mud and horse sweat like a razor blade. It was a foul, rancid odor, like rotted meat and stagnant water. Feral rogues, and not just one. A pack of them. Desperate, starving, and driven mad by the flood. They were downwind, hiding in the thick, dead brush just 50 yards to their left. Cormac looked at Gareth. The Southern Alpha hadn't smelled a thing. His nose was too full of his own imported cologne, his instincts blunted by years of soft living in walled gardens. He was sitting on a frightened, dancing horse, completely blind to the fact that he was about to die. You speak of stimulation, Gareth, Cormac said, his voice flat. He calmly unhooked the heavy iron flail from his saddle horn. Allow me to show you how we stimulate ourselves in the north. Before Gareth could register the words, Cormac spurred his gelding. He didn't ride away. He rode directly at Gareth's skittish mare, slamming his massive horse against the side of the chestnut. The mare shrieked, rearing up. Gareth, caught completely off guard, lost his stirrups and tumbled backward, crashing heavily into the freezing mud. What is the meaning of this? Gareth roared, scrambling to his feet, his tailored coat coated in thick, freezing slime. His two guards drew their swords, shouting. Hold! Cormac commanded, his voice a booming, concussive force that froze the Southern guards in their tracks. Cormac didn't look at Gareth. He stood in his stirrups and faced the dead brush. He let the leash slip. He released his alpha aura, not as a blanket of pressure, but as a directed, violently focused spear of dominance straight into the brush. It was a challenge, a territorial roar made of pure energy. The brush exploded. 6 feral wolves burst from the cover. They were massive, emaciated creatures, their fur patchy, their eyes wild with starvation and madness. They didn't run away. Driven insane by the Alpha challenge, they charged directly at the riding party. Gareth screamed, scrambling backward in the mud, fumbling for his sword. His guards panicked, their horses rearing and bucking in the chaos. Cormac didn't panic. This was the math of the North. The first rogue lunged at Gareth. Cormac swung his flail. The heavy iron ball, spiked and brutal, met the rogue in midair with a sickening crunch of bone. The wolf was thrown sideways, dead before it hit the mud. Dismount! Cormac roared at his men. Finn and the northern guards were already out of their saddles, axes and heavy swords drawn, forming a tight, practiced circle. They met the charging rogues with brutal, efficient violence. It was a butchery of survival, devoid of art or honor. It was just muscle, steel, and blood. Cormac vaulted from his horse. A rogue snapped its jaws inches from Gareth's face. Cormac grabbed the beast by the scruff of its neck with his bare, uninjured hand, his muscles bulging under his tunic. He hoisted the thrashing, 200-pound animal into the air and slammed it down onto a jagged rock protruding from the mud. The spine snapped. In less than 60 seconds it was over. 6 dead rogues lay bleeding in the mud. The northern guard stood over them, breathing heavily, wiping dark blood from their blades. Gareth was still on the ground. He was covered in freezing mud, pale, trembling, and staring at the dead wolf resting less than a foot from his boots. He had never even managed to draw his sword. Cormac walked over to him. His boots squelched in the gore. He stopped, towering over the southern alpha. The iron flail dripped steadily by his side. Cormac's face was devoid of the rage he had felt the night before. It was a mask of cold, terrifying competence. In the south, you play games with smiles and metaphors, Cormac said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He leaned down, gripping Gareth by the lapels of his ruined coat, and hauled him to his feet with effortless strength. Up here, Gareth, if you are not paying attention to your environment, the environment eats you. He let go, shoving Gareth backward. The emissary stumbled, barely keeping his footing. The Queen does not need a whetstone, Cormac stated, his eyes boring into Gareth's terrified soul. She is already sharp. She survived you. She survives this. He gestured to the bloody mud. And she survives me. That makes her more dangerous than you will ever be. Go back to your gardens, little dog. The treaty is signed. But if you ever speak of my wife again, I will not wait for the rogues to tear your throat out. Gareth swallowed hard, his eyes wide and completely stripped of their arrogance. He offered no bow. He simply scrambled toward his trembling horse. Cormac watched him mount up. The jealousy in his chest hadn't faded, but the frantic, panicked edge of it was gone. He had drawn the line in the mud, written in blood. He had protected what was his. Now, he just had to figure out how to face her when he returned. The ride back to the keep was completely silent. Gareth rode at the rear, flanked tightly by his own guards, his eyes fixed firmly on the pommel of his saddle. The southern alpha didn't utter a single word about the weather, the mud, or the resilience of lowland women. He smelled of sweat, fear, and the rancid blood of the rogue that had nearly taken his face. Cormac rode at the front, his posture rigid. The adrenaline that had flooded his system during the slaughter was slowly receding, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache in his left shoulder, where he had wrenched a muscle swinging the iron flail. His knuckles were bruised purple. He smelled of wet iron, wet horse, and copper. When they reached the courtyard, Gareth's men immediately began packing their saddlebags. There was no formal goodbye, no evening feast to commemorate the signed treaties. The Southerners were leaving before the mud could freeze solid in the dark. Cormac dismounted, tossing his reins to a wide-eyed stable boy. He didn't wait to watch Gareth ride out of the heavy iron gates. He had made his point. He walked through the great hall, ignoring the questioning glances of his pack. He didn't want a report from his betas. He didn't want ale. He wanted to strip off his armor, which felt like a frozen iron cage pressing against his ribs, and he needed to stop the low, dangerous hum vibrating in the back of his skull. He climbed the spiraling stone stairs to his bedchamber. The heavy oak door gave way with a familiar groan. The room was hot. The fire had been built up so high that the flames licked the blackened stone of the chimney breast. The sudden shift from the freezing damp of the courtyard to the stifling heat of the room made Cormac's skin prickle. Isolde was standing by the heavy wooden table near the window. She wasn't holding a book. She wasn't at her loom. She was simply standing there, staring at the door, waiting. She wore a simpler dress today, a dark, bruised plum color that stripped away the dull gray of the north and made the amber of her eyes look like struck flint. As Cormac stepped into the room, he saw her gaze drop immediately to his boots, tracking the fresh, dark mud and the unmistakable splatter of dark blood across his shins and forearms. Her breath caught, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound, but in the quiet of the room, to a wolf's ears, it was deafening. "The southern emissary is leaving," Cormac said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly rasp, stripped of any regal cadence. He sounded tired. He walked toward the center of the room and began unbuckling the heavy leather straps of his chest piece. His fingers were stiff with the cold. He fumbled with the iron buckle at his shoulder. Isolde didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask if he was injured. She closed the distance between them, her steps silent on the stone floor. She pushed his hands away from the buckle. Cormac froze. Her hands were warm. Her fingers were small but strong, working the stiff, frozen leather with a practiced efficiency. She smelled deeply of rosemary and the salt of tears that hadn't been shed. She pulled the heavy boiled leather over his head and dropped it to the floor. It hit the stone with a dull, heavy thud. Next was his tunic. It was soaked through with freezing rain and sweat. She grasped the hem and pulled it upward. Cormac raised his arms, a mechanical compliance, allowing her to strip him to the waist. He stood there, a massive, scarred landscape of muscle and old violence, shivering slightly as the hot air of the fire hit his freezing, wet skin. There was a long, shallow scratch across his right bicep, where a rogue's claw had grazed him. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding a slow, steady trickle of dark alpha blood. Isolde looked at the cut. She turned away, walked to the wash basin, and dipped a clean linen cloth into the warm water. She wrung it out, the sound of splashing water the only noise in the room. She returned and pressed the warm, damp cloth against his bicep. The heat of the water stung, but it was nothing compared to the shock of her touch. Her other hand rested flat against his chest to steady herself as she wiped away the blood. Cormac looked down at her. He could see the dark roots of her hair, the tense line of her shoulders. He could feel the exact shape of her palm against his ribs. "I didn't kill him," Cormac said quietly to the top of her head. "I know," Isolde said, not looking up, her focus entirely on cleaning the shallow wound. "If you had, the alarm bells would be ringing, and Finn would be yelling." "I wanted to." The cloth stopped moving. Isolde kept her hand pressed firmly against his arm. She slowly tilted her head back, looking up into his face. The amber of her eyes was perfectly clear, devoid of the polite, glassy stare she usually wore. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Because you smiled at him." The admission felt like vomiting broken glass. It was ugly, undignified, and entirely true. Cormac didn't look away. He let her see the raw, jagged edge of the beast he spent every waking hour trying to suppress. Isolde's breathing hitched again. The hand resting on his chest curled slightly, her fingernails pressing into his skin. "I smiled at him," she said, her voice trembling, but not from fear. "Because for 3 months, I have lived with a phantom. You gave me food, you gave me a fire, but you never gave me yourself. You looked at me like a casualty of war, like a burden you were too honorable to discard." "I looked at you," Cormac countered, his jaw tight, "like a fragile thing that didn't belong in the mud and the blood of this ridge. I kept my distance because I am a violent man, Isolde. I lead by breaking bones and snapping necks. You smell of the sea and sunlight. I thought if I touched you, I would ruin you." "I am not glass, Cormac," she suddenly shouted, her voice cracking with a fierce, sudden anger. She shoved her hand against his chest, hard enough to make him rock back on his heels. "My father is an alpha. I grew up listening to the screams of rogues in the coastal caves. I know what a wolf is. I didn't want a warden. I wanted a mate." She dropped the bloody cloth to the floor. Her chest was heaving, her eyes shining with unshed, furious tears. "When I smiled at Gareth," she confessed, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper, "I hated myself for it. It was cheap. It was a petty, manipulative trick. But I was suffocating in this room, Cormac. I was dying in this silence. I needed to know if you felt anything for me. Anything at all. Even if it was just rage. I needed to see the wolf." Cormac stared at her. The heavy, suffocating iron cage that he had worn around his heart for 3 months, finally, catastrophically, shattered. The silence that followed her confession was heavy, thick with the smell of wet pine, blood, and the sharp, spiking scent of her rosemary. Cormac didn't think. The clinical, calculating Alpha King vanished. The wolf, starved and desperate, took the wheel. He reached out and grabbed her. It wasn't a gentle embrace. His massive, calloused hands gripped her waist, his fingers digging into the heavy fabric of her plum dress. He pulled her flush against his chest with a sudden, violent force that knocked the breath out of her lungs. Isolde gasped, a sharp intake of air, as she crashed against the hard, unyielding wall of his body. She didn't push him away. Instead, her hands flew up, grabbing the thick muscles of his shoulders, her fingers curling into his skin, anchoring herself to him. "You want the wolf," Cormac growled, his voice a dark, vibrating rumble deep in his chest. His face hovered inches from hers, his eyes flashing a bright, dangerous gold in the firelight. "You think you can handle the wolf?" "Yes," she breathed, her chin tipped up, her amber eyes blazing with a defiant, answering fire. Cormac crushed his mouth against hers. It was a collision, a desperate, uncoordinated clash of teeth and raw want. There was no hesitation, no careful exploration. It was the physical manifestation of 3 months of agonizing, enforced starvation. Cormac tasted salt, heat, and a fierce, returning pressure. Isolde kissed him back, with a ferocity that staggered him. She wasn't fragile. She didn't break. She met his brutal, desperate hunger with her own, her hands tangling in his thick, damp hair, pulling him closer, erasing the last fraction of space between them. Cormac groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated against her lips. He backed her up. His heavy boots thudded against the stone floor, driving her backward until her spine hit the heavy wooden post of the bed. The impact rattled the frame. He tore his mouth away from hers, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the pure, undiluted scent of her. The sea salt. The rosemary. The sweet, intoxicating musk of a female wolf, finally accepting a claim. He scraped his teeth lightly along her collarbone, feeling her pulse hammering frantically against his lips. "Mine," he rasped, the word tearing out of his throat, completely stripped of reason. "You are mine. If that perfumed southern bastard had looked at you for 1 second longer, I would have painted the high table with his lungs." Isolde let out a breathless, choked laugh, her hands frantically tracing the heavy scars on his back, feeling the rigid tension in his muscles. "He was a fool," she whispered, her fingers digging into his spine. "I didn't care about his stories. I didn't care about his sunshine. I was watching you. I was only ever watching you." The admission acted like gasoline on an open flame. Cormac's hands moved from her waist, gripping the back of her thighs. He lifted her off the floor effortlessly. Isolde immediately wrapped her legs around his waist, clinging to him as he turned and dropped her backward onto the thick pile of furs on the bed. He followed her down, his heavy body pressing her into the mattress. The bed groaned under their combined weight. Cormac braced his weight on his forearms, looking down at her. Her hair was splayed out across the dark wolf pelts like spun gold. Her lips were swollen, parted slightly as she tried to catch her breath. The polite, numb ghost that had haunted this room for 3 months was dead. In her place was a flushed, disheveled, deeply alive woman. "I don't know how to be soft, Isolde," Cormac said, his voice ragged, chest heaving. It was his final, desperate warning. The last shred of his guilt clinging to the edge of the cliff. "I only know how to endure. I only know how to fight. If you stay in this bed, I will mark you, and I will never let you go. Even if you beg me." Isolde reached up, cupping his rough, scarred face in both of her hands. Her thumbs brushed over the high, sharp cut of his cheekbones. "I am sick of enduring," she said softly, but with absolute conviction. "And I don't want soft. I want real. Mark me, Cormac. Claim what is yours." Cormac's eyes went completely, solidly gold. The last chain snapped. He lowered his head, his mouth finding hers again, and the frozen fortress of the northern ridge finally burned to the ground. The fire had died down to glowing orange embers by the time the grey, filtered light of morning began to creep through the narrow slits of the windows. The bedchamber was cold again, the familiar chill of the north seeping through the stone walls. But for the first time in 3 months, Cormac didn't feel it. He lay on his back, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. His left arm was numb. He didn't move it, because moving it would require shifting the weight of the woman currently asleep, with her head resting on his chest, her bare leg tangled securely with his beneath the heavy furs. Isolde's breathing was slow, deep, and even. The scent of her had changed. The sharp edge of the sea salt and rosemary was now irrevocably blended with the heavy, dark musk of pine and iron. His scent. She smelled like a claimed mate. She smelled like the north. Cormac turned his head slightly, looking at her profile. There was a faint, purple bruise forming on her jaw where his grip had been too tight. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. But as he shifted slightly, Isolde murmured in her sleep and instinctively pressed closer to him, her arm tightening around his torso. The guilt dissolved, replaced by a heavy, profound sense of peace. It was a strange, alien sensation, a muscle he had never used before. He had spent his life believing that emotion was a liability, that a king who felt deeply was a king who could be bled. But as he lay there, listening to the wind howl against the shutters, he realized the flaw in his logic. The ice hadn't made him strong, it had only made him brittle. The wolf inside him, pacified and purring quietly in the back of his mind, was stronger today than it had been in a decade. He had something to fight for that wasn't just dirt and timber. The heavy wooden door to the corridor suddenly rattled. "Cormac," Finn's muffled, gravelly voice came through the thick oak. "The southern perimeter patrols are back. They found 3 more rogues near the old bridge. We need a mandate on the timber rationing." Isolde stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, blinking against the dim light. She looked confused for a fraction of a second before the memories of the night flooded in. She didn't shrink away. She tilted her head back and looked at him, a slow, incredibly warm smile spreading across her face. It was the same smile she had given Gareth, but this time it belonged entirely to him. It wasn't a provocation. It was a sunrise. "Tell them to wait," Isolde whispered, her voice husky from sleep. Cormac stared at her mouth. He felt the familiar, heavy thrum of desire start up again, a low hum in his veins. "Finn!" Cormac called out, raising his voice just enough to carry through the door. His tone was casual, utterly devoid of the tense, barking authority he usually commanded in the mornings. "The timber rationing can wait until noon. Have the cooks prepare a proper breakfast. The Queen and I will eat in the great hall." There was a long pause on the other side of the door. "Understood," Finn finally grunted. Cormac could hear the distinct sound of a smirk in his beta's heavy footsteps as he walked away down the corridor. Isolde laughed quietly against his chest. It was a bright, musical sound that made the bleak stone walls of the keep feel suddenly less oppressive. She propped herself up on one elbow, the furs slipping down to expose her bare shoulders. She looked at the bruising on his chest, tracing a fresh scratch on his collarbone with a gentle finger. "Breakfast in the great hall," she teased softly. "With the pack. The Alpha King doesn't hide his bride away anymore." Cormac reached up, threading his thick fingers through her tangled hair. He gripped the back of her neck, gently but firmly, pulling her down until her forehead rested against his. "I was a fool," Cormac said quietly, his amber eyes locked onto hers. There was no posturing, just raw, unvarnished truth. I thought this place would break you. I didn't realize you were the one who was going to break me. I merely defrosted you, Isolde corrected, her lips brushing against his as she spoke. You were very stubborn about it. Cormac let out a short, rough bark of laughter. The sound startled him. He hadn't laughed in years. The north is still cold, Isolde, he warned her gently, his thumb stroking her cheek. The mud is still deep. There will be blood, and there will be rogues. This life does not get easier. I don't care, Isolde said, her eyes fierce and certain. As long as you never look through me again. Never again, Cormac vowed, sealing the promise with a slow, deep kiss that tasted of mourning and absolute surrender. You have the wolf's attention, my queen. You have all of it. They didn't make it to breakfast by noon. When they finally descended the stone stairs into the great hall, the pack went dead silent. They watched their terrifying, stoic king walk to the high table, not a dozen paces ahead of his lowland bride, but directly beside her. His hand rested firmly on the small of her back. The air around them practically vibrated with a heavy, protective alpha aura that left no room for doubt. The ghost of the northern ridge was gone. The queen had finally arrived, and the Alpha King of Iron and Frost had never looked more alive. That's how you melt an Ice King. Cormac finally dropped the stoic act, and Isolde proved she's not just a political pawn, she's a survivor who knows exactly how to claim her mate. If you loved the raw tension, the jealousy, and the deeply grounded shift from cold isolation to a fiercely possessive romance, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button and share this story with someone who loves a brooding, imperfect alpha. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next dark, sensory-rich werewolf drama. See you in the next video.